Welcome back, participants, and I hope you had a lovely lunch. We have one final session for today, named Navigating the Data Environment, Data Protection and Data Privacy. Before we proceed with the session, I would like to call upon Mr. Kai Keller to deliver a presentation on the appropriate use of customer data in financial services.
Thank you. So you're getting me right before lunch on cyber, and now you're getting me right after lunch on data. In a way that kind of makes sense, because the two inherently are linked into each other. Matthew asked me to briefly share for a couple of minutes some of the work that we have done on the appropriate use of customer data in financial services at the World Economic Forum. I want to speak to that very, very briefly, but more so to the policy consideration and trade-offs that we explored as part of that work. So as I said on the cyber panel, we're working with a broad coalition of stakeholders from incumbent banks, from fintechs, from the public sector, from civil society, trying to understand the changes in the financial ecosystem as a result of technology-enabled innovation. And when we, about 2 years ago, went to that group and said, what are the major risks top of mind for you? The first one was cyber risk, which I don't think is much of a surprise. And then the second one is the use of customer data or the inappropriate use thereof. So we've been looking at this topic for about 1.5 years now, and it's really been a fascinating journey. When we started out, that was before Facebook Analytica, it was before Equifax, it was before GDPR came into effect. And the way in which the dynamic around the data topic has changed created a lot of challenges for me as I was leading this work, but I think also tells a lot about how this topic really came to the forefront, not only of financial services, but more broadly. And it really challenges us to really explore the scope of what financial services is and how financial services relates with other industries. So again, we work with a pretty broad group, and when we started out, we realized, and we tried to get our head around what does the use of data mean in the context of financial services. Well, first of all, we learned it's really, really complex, which I don't think is a breathtaking insight, but I think it's important to consider. Data does not equal data. There's lots of different types of data, and just getting an understanding of the taxonomies around data was really important. It's also a topic that really depends on cultural context. Attitudes towards the use of data and privacy really depend on where you are in the world. What's your view on the individual versus the bigger community? At what point of economic development are you? And I think that to a large degree depends your attitude towards data protection, etc. And then the third thing we realized, it would be really beneficial to get to some global principles to help us sort our thinking around this topic. So that's really what we've been focused on quite heavily over the past year, developing global principles for the appropriate use of customer data. And when we develop these principles, and you see them published in a white paper that we published around the IMF World Bank annual meeting last year in Bali, and they since changed a bit, which I think also reflects the changing dynamics of this. We thought about 5 categories. The first category was consent, where the group that we worked with said the customer should be empowered to provide consent for the use of their data. Second one was control. The customer should remain in control of their data use, and that includes data sharing. Transparency. Financial services providers should be in a position to explain whatever their models generate in terms of output. And the customer should have a right to understand why a certain decision was reached by a machine. There should be value in the use of data, both for the customer and for the provider. And then security, which was probably the easiest one to get alignment on. The responsibility for security sits with the financial services provider, not with the customer. There's a lot of things to consider in that, but I don't want to get into that. What we did at the next step then was try to understand, well, if you largely agree with these principles and you're trying to align with them, either as a private sector stakeholder or as a policymaker, you're inherently going to run into some trade-offs. And I want to speak to a few of those, hoping that they will then help us tee up a conversation on the panel. The first one is about consent, which is extremely messy. Getting to a really good format of consent, I think it's something that the industry hasn't been able to solve for. And I think after GDPR, we all realized how burdensome the ability to provide consent can be for an individual. I think the phenomenon of fintech is all, to me, to a large degree about customer experience, right? The reason why the consumer or many consumers embrace fintech is because it makes the interaction with financial services so much more enjoyable. Now, the higher you set the bar for consent, I think you take away some of that experience. And how do you balance the two? Also, how do you help a customer, particularly a rather illiterate customer, make sense of what consent actually means? Consent is a huge issue still in developed markets. For myself, I probably don't have a good handle around what I'm consenting to when I use various services. Now you think about consent in the context of emerging or developing markets. How do you help a customer that has very little financial literacy to understand what consent really means and what he's or she is consenting to? We heard earlier about the effort to fight financial crime, and I think data is a great enabler to really connect the dots between public sector, private sector, between public sector institution, and it's really it's a real powerful tool to get to greater efficiency in the combat of financial crime. However, if I say that is important, then what does it do to this idea that the customer is in charge of their data or maintains control of their data? There's another trade-off you will be facing. I talked about explainability. The group that we work with thought it's really important that the service provider is able to explain what a certain algorithm is producing in terms of outcomes. However, you might run into situations where explainability comes at the cost of efficacy. So if I have a model that gets me maybe to 80% financial inclusion, but I cannot really explain why the machine is generating that outcome, and I force myself to be able to get to some level of explainability, that inclusion rate might go down to 60%. It's a hypothetical example, but if you run into that situation, then where is your policy preference or your policy priority? And then lastly, I think it's an interesting one that comes up sort of as a back thought in a lot of the conversations we've been having, this idea of innovation ability versus system integrity. And it ties back to the cyber conversation we had earlier. If I set the bar for good cybersecurity fairly high, what does it do to the ability of smaller company of startups to innovate? And at what point do I kill innovation at the preference of system integrity and ability? Again, it's a pretty messy question, and there's a lot of gray in that, but it's an important one to consider. And then so that was related to the principles itself, and then we also took a look at the policy environment and how the policy environment has shifted over the past year and a half. And we already talked earlier about cloud and data localization, and we had another conversation about it over lunch. That's a whole different issue in itself, but what I find really interesting about the data conversation is that we're talking about data in the context of financial services. It's really hard to define where the boundaries of that are. And why should the treatment of data in the context of financial services be different from the treatment of data elsewhere? And a lot of the stakeholders that we engage with are really, really struggling with that. Why should we be held to a higher standard than some of the large techs, for example? Or should this work really be done on a cross-industry level? A lot of the regulators we talk to don't really have a mandate to govern data, right? A lot of you are from the financial services community. But the financial regulator oftentimes doesn't have a mandate to tackle data, right? But we still haven't found the right regulatory structure to govern it. So where does the government sit? And I think there's a global governance question that remains unsolved. And then the last one is this idea of a lot of data policy at the moment being driven by very advanced economies. Europe, obviously, California, there's some others. But the trickle-down effects really affect emerging economies and developing economies. So how do we get the voices of the least developed countries into the conversations that are happening around data, setting data policy, which is something that we hear a lot. And when you think about the bodies that we have at the moment globally that are tackling these issues, they oftentimes don't reflect the voices of those least developed countries, which creates huge repercussions on the downstream end. So I'm going to finish here, because I know Matthew is eager to get the discussion going. Hopefully we can build on some of that in the roundtable.
Thank you.
started, and unfortunately, Hendrik from the ICT Ministry wasn't able to stay for this panel, so we're a little bit lacking on the local constructs, local frameworks, and we may call out to the audience to bring in some of that perspective as we reflect on this complicated subject, as Kai pointed out. But to make it clearer, we're joined by Marcos from Warwick University and Setter from the Central Bank of Ghana. And what I'd like to do is hand the mic over, or everybody's got a mic, so I don't have to hand over, but hand the podium over to Marcos to share a little bit of a perspective on how open banking begins to accentuate some of the challenges and trade-offs that Kai has laid out.
Right, thanks a lot. I have a couple of slides just to reference some of this stuff I'm going to talk about. Where I'm coming from, I'm an academic, first of all. So we've been studying the role of technology in financial services for quite a while. And one of the phenomena we've been studying quite recently, basically, is open banking. For the last 4 years, we have been surveying the industry, talking with a lot of experts in the same way you guys do, perhaps in a bit more rigorous and scientific way. But we're trying to get a perspective of how open banking will change the industry, and how perhaps what are some of the emerging kind of business models that some of these financial services companies want to use in order to respond to this regulation. And something that we always come across, which is to the point of this panel basically, is data. So and it's been quite interesting if you look at different open banking, and since part of our job here is basically to reflect on things that are happening around the world and feed them back to perhaps regulators here. What we've been talking about with different regulators around the world, we see that open banking as a concept or as a phenomenon can vary quite a bit depending on the context of the different kind of economies and the different approaches have to data. For example, and this is where my slide kind of refers to, this is a table that I pulled out from the Fingleton report. So the Fingleton report was the first report that the Fingleton Associates, a company that was commissioned from the Cabinet Office in the UK to do a study on what would open banking be like. They gathered a few evidence around how data, potential role of access to data, can actually change the different pain points we have seen in banking competition in the UK. And you can see that some of them kind of resonate with what Kai already presented. For example, I guess barriers to interest, transparency of pricing for consumers. That can be much more visible when you actually have data to demonstrate or compare different services across the different institutions, or about the quality, the transparency of quality of services. This is also quite important. So you'd need data will help you there to also kind of allow customers to know what they're buying essentially and how much it's worth, right, in terms of the quality of the services they're consuming. In other categories, like not only just pricing or quality of the services, but also the switching costs can be kind of readdressed, in the barriers to entry for new competitors basically can also change if you have more access to data. And this is what open banking is actually doing. That's why it started essentially. The second paper that was after the Fingleton report was from the Open Data Institute. That is a seminal kind of a piece of work that, on top of that, the CMA9, etc., the Competition Access Authority in the UK constructed the CMA9 kind of group to establish and implement open banking in the UK. So everything is basically around open data. And there are different approaches around the world. For example, in the UK, we have access to data and through the APIs, and data standards of the APIs are really important on that. So standardization is one of the big things, but also how much you want to give access to data, as Kai kind of mentioned. So this trade-off in many different kind of points in the discussion also matters a lot. So in the UK, as I said, you have payment initiation, which is basically read and write access to data. But in other countries, they chose not to go down that road. So Australia, for example, they have only access to transactions. So only reach APIs that allow customers to pull out their data or share the data with other kind of third parties. And so, you know, that's kind of like, you know, what open banking is trying to do. And some of the points, I think, for example, around customer experience have been very central, some of these concepts, because if you want to, we're talking about consent, for example, if you want to provide consent and you want to share your data with other kind of third parties, that kind of might intervene with your nice customer experience. And some of the regulations, GDPR, for example, will want you to reapprove your consent every now and then, which can be kind of like a pain point for some of these kind of third-party applications which claim to have a better experience for customers. So I think this is how the two kind of resonate. What we do as part of our study essentially is also to understand how open data or open more access to data will have an impact on competition or the market structure, as we call it. And I had another slide from a paper basically that we've written on how conditions in banking might change. Is the next one actually. So, and what we observe, and which is also part of theory in economics, is that a lot of the banks and institutions at this point in time, where the structure of a lot of the financial service institutions is very product-based and vertically integrated, and we see that more openness to data will actually make the entire structure of the market more modular, right? So you'll have a lot of third parties, because you can now communicate data between the different kind of layers, if you want, in the banking architecture. We will see a lot of third parties, and we have seen a lot of third parties kind of emerging in the different parts of the structure of the bank or the services that we consume, because now data can be communicated effectively in a standardized way between the different institutions. So this is, you know, like bringing some context from the studies we have done and how do we look data, basically.
Great, and that has interesting implications for the structure of banking going forward, and the structure of financial services as they're provided by a combination of different players using that data. So it's another potential positive about opening up the data environment and allowing freer flows across different parties. But we have this set of trade-offs that Kai had mentioned. Cedar, perhaps you can tell us how you're viewing this as a regulator and in your environment, and what challenges you see and what progress or approaches are being taken in your market.
Yeah, thank you very much. In Ghana, we have a legal framework for data protection, an act that was passed in 2012. And there are provisions that each licensed data controller need to follow. For example, issue of consent, processing of data, ability of owner of a data to object to use of data. Now, practically, if you come to the central bank, how do we operationalize this? For instance,
sorry, just a moment. Does that data framework cover all sectors, or is it focused on
all sectors of the economy?
Okay, thank you.
So we require you, every financial institution is supposed to be licensed by the Data Protection Agency. You need to get that license before you can approach a central bank for the license. In the same way, our new Payment System and Services Act also, there's a provision that says that if you want to be licensed as a fintech or as a payment service provider, you need to get Data Protection Agency license, because we are concerned about privacy issue and confidentiality, then transparency. Now, with the issue of fintech, one practical thing we have also noticed is that you will see that fintechs, for example, in terms of credit delivery, they have built certain algorithms that they partner with banks to deliver credit. And these algorithms, they determine the level of credit to give. In most instances, the commercial banks don't even understand how these algorithms work. So in the central bank, we make it mandatory that the provider of the algorithm should be able to explain to the financial institution how the algorithm works. The reason is, in Ghana, credit is only delivered by a licensed institution, a bank, not a non-bank. Our model is different from other countries that I'm aware of that. For example, you can have your own platform and give you our credit. In Ghana, you can't do that. We promote collaboration, but you bring your algorithm, the banks will bring the credit. Then the credit will be delivered through the algorithm. To ensure transparency and for the bank to be accountable for any loan losses that we emerge, we insist that the technical solution provider explain the algorithm. Because we have a practical situation recently where a bank came into partnership with a fintech and they are providing credit. And this algorithm gives credit based on your performance and then based on your credit score, taken from use of social media and other things. And the bank was facing very high non-performing loans. And it came to our attention that the managers of the bank didn't even understand how the algorithm is working. So the issue of transparency, even as highlighted in the earlier presentation, is very important. Whereas we are interested in data privacy, at the same time leveraging on data to deliver credit, we are also interested in parties that come together to leverage on mass data for delivery of financial services. So in the central bank, we ensure that data privacy is a priority because we need to build the trust of our consumers or the consumers. Because if, like this morning I said, if I give $100 to my wife and then it's on social media that I've just transferred $100, I will not use the system again. So building trust and ensuring confidentiality is an essential ingredient. And then one thing good about our Data Protection Act also is that every year, all data controllers, we call them data controllers, every financial service provider is a data controller. You have to go back and renew based on your performance in the previous year. And there are very strict regime for that. Now, if you talk about the earlier presentation my colleague made in terms of the new directive that came in the European Union, and it's not surprising that Australia has some other countries have taken different approaches. And that is the same message I want to say here again. These innovations that are coming may not be applicable to some of the jurisdictions. We need to look at our jurisdiction. For example, if you look at a typical Ghanaian in the rural area, rural community, who even in some cases, location to even know his address is a problem, to even, what he needs is just credit. And you want to ensure that he should give a consent for his credit history to be shared. You may not achieve anything. So that also buttresses the earlier discussion I was having. I was saying earlier in the morning that we need to look at all these innovations that are coming and see how we can adapt them to our system and get the best out of it. So it's true, we've read a lot from other jurisdictions in terms of open data, open banking, API going on. What we are doing as a country is that we are learning from these best practices and try to come up with a regime that is applicable to Ghana. And we have our own story to tell because our system is far different from people are thinking about survival. They are not thinking about their data being shared or whatever. So there are other regimes that we put in place. Thank you.
Thank you. You've given us a couple of very important concepts to be thinking about. One is the transparency and explainability of the models, and there's elements there that I'd like to delve into a little bit more. Another is the aspects of consent and what that means to different customers. But you've also touched on the need for different types of models in different countries. And one area where there's been a lot of changes, innovations in some senses, an adoption of a notion across countries is in data nationalization or localization, as it's called differently in different contexts. Is protection of what has Ghana's approach been on that, and is localization necessary to protect consumers?
That is a very good question. That is the debate going on. The issue is...
That's why I want to have it right here.
The issue is when we localize our data, does it really protect the consumers, if it protect the country? Or the issue is if we allow cloud computing, we allow data to be put elsewhere, does it protect the country? So what is happening now, we are gradually moving towards localization. Not only with respect to data, even with respect to processing. For example, in the past, if you take Visa and MasterCard, even use of Visa card has to be processed outside Ghana. And starting from this year, September, we say all domestic Visa transactions have to be processed in Ghana. The reason is we know Visa and MasterCard are fighting, and I was having some discussion with a lady, one of the participants. The latest information I had was that they went to lobby our president not to sign our bill because some aspect of the act is it will harm their operation. And this is something I want to share with the Bank of Seychelles. We are going to have a lot of opposition come here with trying to promote your domestic economy, because there are a lot of these international organizations, their main aim is to come and make profit. They transfer it, they affect your currency. At the same time, they say you are not managing your economy well. Now, in Ghana, we have taken a decision to process, because I don't understand. I have done a local Visa transaction. Why should it be processed in the US? It should be processed in Ghana. So if I come here to Seychelles and I use my Visa card, it can be processed in Jamaica or anywhere, I don't care. But a Visa and MasterCard that I use in Ghana, why should we be processing? And even this one, Visa and MasterCard, they are fighting it. So the issue of data localization and whether it should be internal is a very big debate. Even if you've been to various, I know, even US. If there was a conference I asked one of the IMF guy, will US allow their Senate data to be processed in Ghana? No. So why bullying the developing countries? And so we need these development partners to support smaller countries to solve their problem. Because if we continue this way, generation to generation to come, we have lost our identity in everything. If we common data processing, Visa domestic processing, we can't do it. It should be done outside. So the issue of localization of data is a big issue, and we are gradually moving towards that. We have started in our new bill passed by Parliament that it should be done. It should be in Ghana. Even now, not all aspects of financial services information can be outsourced or can be done outside Ghana. You must get approval of the central bank to do that. So gradually, we are moving towards that, but as I have said already, there are stiff opposition coming from various angles.
So I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but I'll put you a little bit on the spot on this. Because we heard in the previous panel that actually moving to the cloud can actually improve for the local security perspective, because some of the providers have better infrastructure, better cybersecurity, higher quality data centers than might be available locally, although that might be something to aspire to over time. But in this particular case, again, I want to go back to the privacy and data security question. Is it, and given that improved infrastructure that might be provided by some of the global service providers, is it actually an issue, is a localization to protect privacy, or is it because you want to move the economics, as you pointed out? You want the servicing done locally because you want to have more of the fee generating business done locally, or you want lower costs with local processing. So is this an economic question or a privacy question?
It's both. I'm a believer, for me, I'm a believer in a system that we can do everything. The issue of taking it to crowd because they have a better infrastructure, if we don't start now, forever we can't do anything. Yes, we have domestic infrastructure that may not be robust like international infrastructure that is in the crowd, which may be cheaper. But the issue is, it has implications, both for privacy and then for the economy.
Okay, so let's say take it as both. Want to get some reactions from the Kai. What have you seen more broadly, and your industry participants? How are they viewing this trend towards data localization and data nationalization? And can it support? Are there legitimate areas where we should be looking for that as a way to nail down privacy, or is this a little bit of a red herring?
Well, the brief answer is they're not fans, and I don't think that's much of a surprise, as you already alluded to. Now, as you said, we talked about data localization on the previous panel around cyber, and I also want to bring it back to the conversation we had yesterday around talent and how do you provide the right education system to generate the talent you need for a thriving fintech or innovative financial system to operate. Cyber is something where talent is extremely spare. And it's not only in this environment, you go to the US, to Europe, the big banks are struggling to attract the right talent, right? And as you said, where's that talent, if it exists, ending up? It's probably at the AWS's, the Ali clouds of the world. So that's why I would push back a little bit and say, in the interest of security, the cloud is probably the safest environment there might be. I'm not plugging for the cloud, but I'm just saying, consider what resources you realistically have at your disposal, and make a decision based on that. The other thing is, as much as I sympathize with your idea of taking local or regional considerations into the equation, I'm very worried that if every jurisdiction develops their own framework, whether it's on data or on cyber, we're inherently moving away from this beautiful world of financial services that is truly global, right? The flow of money, the flow of data. It's financial services more so than others. It's a global system. By the United States, one is a European world led by GDPR, and the other was an Asian world that is very much dominated by China. Is that really an outcome that is desirable? I would argue it's not. And while I'm agreeing with you that we need to pay justice to what the local circumstances are, we also need to make sure that whatever standards we set are, that they're interoperable, and that we take a more of a regional approach to the challenges we're facing than everybody trying to do their own thing.
Is there a consumer choice element there as well? Should a consumer be empowered to choose whether he or she would like their data handled in the European way or a Chinese way or an American way or indeed a Ghanaian way?
Yeah, I think the answer is no, because we're putting a lot of burden now on the consumer, right? And the consumer to understand what sort of service they're engaging with. And as I said earlier, even I'm not always sure what sort of service I'm consenting to. So maybe that's an ideal outcome, but I think it completely overwhelms the consumer. And as policymakers and as industry leaders, we have a responsibility of getting this right, not on behalf of the consumer, but enabling the consumer then to make good choices instead of just saying, it's your problem, here's all the autonomy, deal with it, and people being like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And they're just going to go after the next best service, either because it's really cheap or it's a really great experience. They don't have the capacity to really examine what they're engaging with.
Let's come back to that in a minute. Marcos, you wanted to comment on the localization.
Just to chip in a little bit and say that I kind of agree with the argument that it's hard. You know, if you take everything at a regional level, local level, then the matter of having a fully integrated, interoperable financial system can be challenged. So I think there's been a lot of work being done on data standards, obviously, and we see that now, for example, with blockchain infrastructures, they kind of show up and they want to become payment systems. So the big question there for me as an academic who I'm looking payment infrastructures for a while now is how interoperable these will be with other payment systems around the world and how embedded they can be in the process of the banks. Now, on the question of I guess the concerns that somebody else might have access to your data, this is not a new argument. And I'm just going back to Swift for a bit. We've studied Swift for about 12 years now. We started a study on Swift in 2006. One of the important issues we have seen kind of emerging throughout the history of Swift is that debate of who has access to SWIFT data, right? And I mean, if you ask SWIFT, they'll claim nobody has access and nobody has any kind of authority to access the data. But what happened at some point was when the Bush administration pushed for access to SWIFT's payments data for counterterrorism reasons, right? And that was hidden for a while, but then kind of emerged in the media, and there was kind of a huge story as to, you know, who has access to these kind of infrastructures, and can these be kind of used as a political weapon? And we have seen that, like in the case of Iran, for example, when the US kind of decided to put on some sanctions, and then the EU also agreed to that, suddenly kind of Iran found itself outside of all these systems. So that kind of makes you think, if I'd like to be kind of the next country that some parts of the world would disagree with me, can I be excluded from these kind of systems? So I guess the question of creating, not necessarily breaking up everything, but I can see that different nations want to have control of their own infrastructure and be able to operate with others on you know, based on their choice and at equal kind of levels of trust, etc. So these are kind of issues that.
Right. So autonomy of a local payments system. Slightly different question than the data per se, because they don't. One can look to.
But that was the point.
One can look to bring the payments and transactions into a under local control without necessarily talking about the infrastructure or where the data resides. Because on a temporary basis or on a transactional basis, the data could be anywhere, but we still could operate the switch locally.
On that debate, basically, to link to that argument, was that after that happened with the US, they had to change the architecture of SWIFT. So they created an additional kind of European data hub that all the transactions in Europe stayed in Europe, and transactions can perform in the US stayed in the US, right? And there are different rules on top of that as well. But that kind of fits back into your point as to why, if I use my Visa card in Ghana, well, everybody has access everywhere. So, you know, this kind of, there's a blend between data access and infrastructure, because I don't think you can split these two apart and have them and treat them kind of separately. These are well integrated. So I think arguments kind of are based on both things. So.
Can I make a short comment about it? I think I perfectly agree with you. Europe has SEPA, Single Euro Payment Area, and they have Target 2. Why can't Africa get its own integrated system? Do we need to depend on them? So I perfectly agree. You were just even buttressing my point. The issue is, if we continue in this way, there are a lot of resources that are moving out of Africa. Not only in terms of data privacy, as I said, both. Currently, under the Association of Africa Central Bank, there is a regional initiative to have integrated Africa payment platform where all the regions will be linked. Data should be hosted in Africa. So if Europe has SEPA and Target 2, why can't we also have that initiative to do that? I'm not calling for localization of each country having its own data or systems in their country. At the same time, we are looking at data privacy. The issue that our colleague participant made, which is valid. Today, I know the developed countries can bully any developing country. If your data is not even hosted in the cloud or even kept outside, they can even ask you bring it today, you bring it. Notwithstanding that, if you don't want, because of privacy issue, you don't want your data to go out of your country, why will you say that? And I don't agree that using cloud system is better than using your local system. There will be a lot of debate about that at various international forums. And I think even in the last conference I attended in the US, it was established that it's better you localize your data. They themselves said it. So because the cloud system, who manages it? The central bank will lose control of it. If something happened, there is demonstration on the street. Who are you going to hold? The central bank will tell the citizens that it was on the clouds. So there are a lot of debate on that. And I think this is an area that as innovations and technology is coming, we central bank, we are being challenged to look at all this innovation and see how we can protect the public interest.
Yeah, I think there'll be some interesting trade-offs there in terms of cost as well as some of these things move forward, and we'll begin to see that differences, for example, in the cost of running a local data center versus using the broader cloud-based infrastructure. There are certain economies of scale. Also in running local payment switches, ultimately there'll be a question of whether it's actually more cost-effective to have a local switch, or if people are willing to pay the higher cost for the sake of having their own infrastructure on a relatively small economy. And certainly that's a challenge that may be faced here. So it would be interesting as we get to the Q&A session to perhaps hear some local perspectives on how those trade-offs might be made. But there's a couple of other aspects that I want to touch on with the panel before we go into the Q&A. And Kai, I'm aware that you've got a plane to catch, so when you need to leave, just do so, and everybody will understand. The question just came up about consent, and really the question is there any such thing as informed consent at this point? I don't know how many times I've promised my next paycheck or firstborn or whatever by clicking yes to something that was 5 screens full of small print that I clearly didn't read. But in what context can we get towards a more informed notion of consent?
I'll take the question before I jump off the stage. I don't have the answer to that, and I think a lot of people are still struggling with developing appropriate and meaningful ways of getting consent from the consumer. But I think it raises a larger issue, not only on data, but on the whole phenomenon of fintech or innovative financial services. How do we prepare the consumer to engage with whatever we put in front of them? And I think we need to do some really deep thinking in how do we need to evolve our education curriculum, what's the responsibility of the service providers, and making sure that we don't just put amazing offerings out there, but educate a consumer that is capable and clearly understands what they're engaging with, and that they don't find out 5 years, 10 years later the repercussions of what they did in a rather uninformed way. So that doesn't answer your question, I understand that. But I think across all the panels we're having, and we had one on education particularly yesterday, we really need to reflect on, are the folks that we are delivering these services for ready to actually consume them?
Certainly user education was one of the things we talked about yesterday. But thank you very much, and please everybody, your appreciation for Kai. Safe travels. We'd like to localize that equipment here. But the rest of us are still here for a little longer, and we'd like to get to you as well. There's one thing that I want to just put forward when we talk about the use of data and the consent that people are giving. We should note that a lot of the applications of big data create 2 kinds of value from a customer's data. There's the value in serving that customer, which may be the targeted advertising or customized financial services or a credit score that's done for that particular customer. We also recognize that those credit scoring algorithms, those black boxes, are tuning and setting the algorithm based on data that they're using from everybody else. And so in a sense, there's an indirect use of my data. So my data may be helping me to get credit, but it's also helping the provider to create a baseline and score everybody else. How do we make sure that that the customer's privacy is adequately protected when their data is being used to serve everybody else? Does my consent to use my data to serve me extend also to the use of my data to serve somebody else?
That is a very, very, very interesting question. In the context of Ghana, I'll talk about Ghana practically. Let me tell you, people, especially in terms of that service that they want to take from the service provider, people are eager to take the service, especially if you take credit. Practically, especially in developing countries, if you take Ghana, people want the loan. They don't care about, I'm talking about underprivileged, those below the pyramid, who needs maybe $10 to, especially we have some gentlemen and ladies who need $10 in a day to buy water and sell by the roadside, and by the close of the day they pay through mobile money, and then they recycle it over a period. You're not concerned about this data privacy.
Survival trumps privacy.
Yes. But when you go above the pyramid, where we have the middle class, and they are concerned about the use of their data, the truth is you really need to get someone's consent. Those in the middle, in the top, you need their consent before you can use it, even to price other product for someone. So that is the structure of usage of data in my country. There's below the pyramid, they need just to access the credit and move on. Middle and top, that is where, as a data controller, you have to be very careful not to be sued for using his private data.
So increasing sensitivity to data use as income goes up, is what you're saying.
So that's why I agree with my colleague panelists who just left, that consumer education is very, very important, especially below the pyramid. We need to educate our people on their rights and responsibilities, and which bring to mind expanding the role of the central bank beyond the traditional price stability function, especially in developing countries, which you need to take on. Because if you want your financial market to develop, you need to equip your people with the necessary financial information so that they know their rights and their responsibilities. Because there are some of the financial services that they consume, they don't know their rights. And unfortunately, too, they don't have any recourse mechanism to have a redress.
Yeah, on your point, I think it's hard to separate the two, because when you consume basically the benefits you get from your own data analysis, you're also using somebody else's data to be benchmark towards that. So if you say yes, for example, to using everybody else's data for your own benefit, but please don't include my data on helping the others, I think that's not sustainable for any data provider or data controller or person who does kind of any meaningful analysis.
And of course, this isn't new. A FICO score was also benchmarked against characteristics that did or did not result in defaults over a long period of time. So there's nothing new under the sun here. But there is a new approach towards data and privacy and a new sensitivity towards how our data is being used. How do we educate consumers about the fact that their data is going to be used to provide services to others, even if it's not necessarily to them? Or I might be somebody with a low score, and therefore my data is being used to benchmark whom one should not lend to.
Yeah. So I think transparency is important. So I think you should let people know how their data is being treated. But I think it would be fair to say, for example, do you have some rules about this, right? So if you don't choose to share your data, perhaps you might not be able to access this and that service, because on that basis, you're not allowed to use, data from other people, gain benefit from other people's data. So this is kind of like a, I guess, consent to sharing your data, but also transparency as how your data is being used. I think, this needs to be quite clear for the consumer to act on that. So.
And one last thing that I just want to touch on is in this issue of transparency and explainability in how the data is being used, how do we ensure that these black box algorithms don't touch on sort of protected classes of race or gender or other areas where discrimination would not be acceptable in the broad society, but might be implicit in the way that these black boxes operate?
Yeah, for example, practically in Ghana, that's why we call for the service providers, because I perfectly agree with you. You don't need to discriminate. It's against our laws. You don't need to discriminate either on race, gender, or whatever. So as a service provider or the data controller, it is your responsibility to really appreciate the algorithm, which you call it the black box, that is being used to deliver the credit or to deliver the pension, to deliver the insurance. You will be held accountable because it is your primary responsibility to ensure that consumers are treated fairly and there's no discrimination. I know that for some of the fintechs, they are not ready to share how this algorithm works. They think it's their proprietary system. However, the stand we have taken in Bank of Ghana is that if you are ready to share, we give you the license. If you are not ready to share, because we cannot license something which is opaque.
And that's consistent also with risk modeling that approaches that supervisors have taken in many other contexts, right? The risk model that a bank uses can't be a black box that can't be explained by the bank to its supervisors. Let's open now to questions, and perhaps if anybody can also give us a little bit of a sense of, in the absence of our intended panelist Hendrik from the ICT Ministry, if anybody can give us a sense of the state of play here in Seychelles and where the data privacy debate has reached.
Good afternoon. My name is Divino Sabino. Originally, I just have a question for the panel, but I happen to also be a lawyer, so based in Seychelles, so I can say that the data privacy situation is still not very advanced. We passed a law maybe some 15 years ago, the Data Protection Act, but was never ascended to. So there's a law on paper that's just there. I suppose it's right now quite out of date and will need some updating. Like I said, I'm a lawyer. I'm also an alumni of Warwick University. I did my undergrad degree there. And being a lawyer, my question's more to do with the legal side of data protection rather than technology. And it's directed towards our academic on the panel. And it's focused on nationalized data, like rather data held in a jurisdiction rather than on the cloud. Perhaps I have to give a small story before I ask my actual question. Recently, we got a court order against a Seychelles entity to release certain information. And the Seychelles entity came back to us saying, well, you know what, I'd love to give you all that information, but we actually moved everything to this Eastern European country. But we'll ask that Eastern European country to get the data for us. Many months have passed, we never got that information. All well and good, we can hold the local entity in contempt of court, but that doesn't serve what we want. We want that information. So my question is there any research or current or past that's being done with regards to how easy it is or how hard it is to access information in particular jurisdictions? And if there is such research, is it being used by financial institutions, probably in the private sector? And I see my Ghanaian friend seems amused about this question. You don't have to answer it. I wouldn't want to put you or the Central Bank of Ghana in any trouble. Thank you.
Let me just add something to that, because there's an interesting aspect here, and data is an asset, and this asset happens to be sitting offshore, and they've claimed, I mean, we would think that the data could be transferred easily, but if it were a bar of gold that we were saying we wanted to get back, and it happened to be sitting offshore, it might not be so easy to bring back. How do you think about the answer to that question, and put it in the context of data as an asset?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not, I won't be able to speak on behalf of colleagues at the University of Warwick that are doing research in the law department. But I guess my gut feeling, as I've been studying kind of financial services for a while, is that court order at a certain jurisdiction doesn't necessarily apply to other countries unless a country has an agreement with another country. And so it can be way more challenging to pursue access to data or value or an asset to a different country when there is no clear case for the other country that this should be done, or maybe it goes against some kind of rule on privacy or security for in their own jurisdiction. So, I mean, I don't have an answer, you know, this is wrong or right, for example. But one thing I have been trying to follow in terms of an asset kind of moving from one country to another has been when a big hack happened in the Bank of Malaysia, and some years to be able to get challenging. And obviously, in your case, is data, which is a bit more vague, perhaps, and not as concrete. In that case, was money, which can be very concrete. So
all money is data now.
All money is data. Yeah. So I treat these two as equal in this example. So.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and in a way, from council there, and this is why countries are actually moving towards the localization of data. Some time back, when I was in the central bank, we had a similar situation to what council has alluded to, trying to get data, and even for me, I can't remember whether we got that information. So. When it gets to the big jurisdictions, it's actually very difficult to get information if it is housed outside. This led us to a new regime of licensing offshore data housing. The regime was simply that we had to get the consent, agreement, a home host country relationship. So we had to sign, if you're going to house the data in Ghana, the Central Bank of Ghana, who's the supervisory authority of whoever is housing the data, must give an undertaking to the Bank of Zambia that should we require this information, it will be made available. So that became a precondition. Yep. To that. So that's the solution that we had temporarily. So in that situation, we would rely on the home host agreement and then ask the central bank concerned to try and provide that data within the terms of the agreement, because they then go down to how long, how many days it should take and things like that to think. But short of that, to be quite honest, it's a very lopsided and there are challenges when it comes particularly to AML, CFT fighting in jurisdictions that require this data. And I think that's the downside. That's the real downside about this data sitting in other jurisdictions.
Indeed, I think what you've pointed to is the need for appropriate outsourcing frameworks and contracting and sometimes bilateral agreements to support all of this. About 2 years ago, I was privy to a session between a cloud service provider and a number of central banks, and they were talking in part about the use of cloud-based core banking systems. And some of the regulators expressed the concern that if there were a need to intervene in a bank, and they don't know where the systems are because they're sitting on a cloud someplace. And then we tried to peel that apart, because ultimately if you're intervening in a bank, there's a question of, is the IT department cooperating with the supervisors or not? If they're not cooperating and it's local, they can erase everything too. So that you may actually be better off if they're not cooperating, if it's sitting on Amazon and there's a contract which states that in the event of a legal intervention by the supervisor, Amazon is then required to make available the data. So again, it depends on the provisions of the contracting and how that can potentially be enforced. Any other questions from the, yes?
So there was, I think, a very important point raised around skills development in countries. And if countries start, it's not just the data, but it's the skills related to running big data centers, to maintaining them, to operating them, to managing key stores, cryptographic, etc. So my question is, and maybe to turn it around on its head a little bit, is if countries started investing in the skills, would they not attract cloud providers to come and host? So I know, I was just thinking through, you know, there's been a number of events happening in South Africa. We've had the central bank run a very successful project with some fintechs. We've had, based off that, a number of companies getting spawned. We've had universities now introducing courses. So there's a whole lot of things. I'm sure there's other influences around all of that. And then we now have an Azure data center in South Africa, and we've just had we'll have an Amazon data center getting set up. So there's definitely momentum around all of these things. And I suppose my question is it policy to say you cannot export data which will drive this, or is it investment into skills development that will then just naturally start attracting it? So I suppose there's the old story of the Australian farmers who have such big cattle farms that they can't fence them. So someone said, how do you stop the cows running away? They said, no, we just provide fresh water for the cows, so they stay. So you either build fences to keep your cattle in, or you provide fresh water. So I suppose the question is it a stick or a carrot to promote these things in country?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I perfectly agree with you that when you have as a policy that, for example, you want your data to be kept in your country, you are going to get firms springing up to provide those services. And let me add that Ghana, we just have Google that has opened its office in Ghana, I think about 3 weeks ago. And then we have some international companies also opening. In our Data Protection Act and most of our acts, our provision is that data must be kept for a minimum of 5 years. So we will not have the issue that our colleague from Seychelles and then my senior brother from Zambia stated. If a court wants data, because it's in our legislation already, the data must be kept for 5 years. You must produce it. So the issue is, if you create the enabling environment as a regulator for these services to emerge, capacity will be built. And I believe that in every country, those capacities, they exist, only that giving the opportunity to the people to do that, and that will happen. So the issue of data privacy is a very big issue, which is a national security issue. Even though we are not even talking about the economics of it, it's a national security issue. So it depends on how each country, for example, the earlier panel that we listened to, we were discussing the cyber security, setting up SET and SOC. Will you set your SOC or your SET outside your country? No. You need to have your SOC in your operational area or very close to it. So if there is any emergency, you can report to the SET. So these are big issues that are being debated, and gradually, countries are moving towards localization. Even if we talk about the earlier discussion, we have payments. Most countries are trying to get their domestic switch. We had our domestic switch in 2007, and it has helped the country to develop in terms of payment system infrastructure.
Should I contribute to that? So I agree. I mean, it could be both ways. It could work out, actually. If you have a regulation, we have seen that sometimes it kind of can spark further innovation or investments in infrastructure, et cetera, and it works the other way around. If you have a concentration of talent and skill, that can also bring more know-how to the greater ecosystem and produce innovation. I guess we've seen that one way or another in the UK. I mean, London is one of the fintech hubs in the world for two reasons. A lot of regulation that is quite forward-looking, encouraging a lot of innovation, but nothing would have happened if there wasn't a lot of talent in London coming from many different kind of industries, both technology, financial services, etc. So I guess I could even bring into the discussion a further kind of element, because you mentioned about cloud. I would also mention about people who can actually analyze the data. So that's also very important talent to have, because you don't just have to have the infrastructure and the ability to hold the data, but also have the people and the talent to analyze the data and monetize it and do some good out of it. So I think that's also something to encourage in the economy, and certainly we've seen a lot of degrees nowadays on big data and analytics, all different parts of the world, in the UK certainly, in the US as well, and different parts again. And one last thing about the localization, I think, just to be clear that, I mean, you want to encourage that when there is a matter of national security or, you know, the integrity of the data and privacy and even ethics at some level. But you always have to mind that you don't want to be a siloed economy or a siloed infrastructure. You have to be able to integrate to the rest of the world. I think that's super important to just be clear on that. And the way to do that, we have seen from other countries, is to encourage the adoption of global standards. Because the data standard is really important to be able to be interoperable and communicate data, you know, assets, etc., with the rest of the world. But then the infrastructure you can keep more local and control as to how you treat the data, how long you keep the data, etc. So we have seen standards like ISO 20022 emerging and being very interesting cases for adoption, even in open banking. If you think about it, you know, what the APIs are going to communicate, it's not just the standard for the API, but the actual fields that can be borrowed from the semantics of ISO 20022. So this is really important to have, and to create an asset, which is going to be the data, that can be readable and exploitable. Otherwise, you kind of silo yourself, you corner yourself out, and maybe you're not even able to utilize knowledge out there on how to analyze these data. So just to be clear on that, because...
No, thank you. I tend to go for fresh water more than fences and walls, but I think, you know, ending up here, because we have to actually acknowledge that there are economies of scale, and it won't necessarily be efficient to have separate instances of all of the global infrastructure existing in every location. You won't find, even in the US, where, you know, many of the states have a population greater than many of the countries in this region, they don't each have a server farm and an instance of an installation by Amazon or Azure or the other providers. So it's a balancing act that people have to look at very carefully in the context of their own economy and the robustness of the skills level, which would also be worth building, but also recognizing that there becomes a cost to insisting on localization of every particular good and service. But that notion of interoperability, and one of the ways to bridge between these becomes an important piece, because even if you, as you move along that spectrum from local to international, maintaining some kind of global standards or an interoperability allows that movement even within different choices with respect to localization. And so with that, I think we'll wrap up. Please thank my panelists for their interventions, and thank the audience.
Thank you, Mr. Saul and panelists, for your valuable contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, before we come to a close, I would now like to call on Mr. Alex Chang-Sam, the Director of Capital Markets and Collective Investment Scheme Section from the Financial Services Authority, to present an overview of today's discussions.
Hi everyone. No, I don't need this. I'm short enough, so I'm gonna keep this short and sweet, a bit like me. Can you all see me at the back? Yeah, I'm actually standing up. So, yeah. Anyways, jokes aside. So I think we've had a long, productive day. Interesting discussions. The first session actually I was on there, so pretty close to my heart. It dealt with regulatory approaches of fintech with regards to supervision and oversight. And God, 1 second. Okay. A bit nervous. Okay, so what came out of this session this morning was that there is a real need to have a regulatory approach to fintech that fits the domestic context. I mean, we can have consultants come in and tell us what to do and how to do, but then it's important for us to pause and see what really makes sense for us, and to have something that works for us. And in that process, I think there is a need to have a proper dialogue between all stakeholders domestically to make things work, to engage the business community, to have engagement between regulators, and to understand that this is not, I mean, if we are to come up with a national policy for fintech, to understand that this would be something that would be a living document that would need to be adaptable to a changing and rapidly changing environment. Also important in the context of cooperation is not only to have cooperation domestically, but also to have cooperation internationally in the region, but also wider than that. In the second session, we had a look about, we discussed fintech with regards to AML and CFT. And what we saw was that fintech presents both a great promise. There is, because of technology, we would be able to simplify things, lower compliance costs, remove, for example, all the false positives that we get with STRs, improve case management, and also we would have better data management. So great promises because of fintech. But also on the flip side of it, we also have a number of challenges. Some of these challenges overlap with the discussions that we had just before lunch and after lunch with regards to cybersecurity and data privacy. And there is a need to put in place adequate safeguards because of these challenges, to put our heads together to see how we can bridge any gaps. There is a need for education, for building capacity both within regulators but also for the consumers. And I think the bottom line that we agreed was that if we are to make fintech a success with regards to AML, but also with regards to what I spoke earlier was with regards to supervision and oversight, is whatever strategy that we have is one that should bring all relevant stakeholders together. And then just before lunch, we had a discussion with regards to cybersecurity and cloud computing. And what was discussed was that new technology creates new risks, obviously, and there is an importance of having a national cybersecurity policy. We've seen this in Morocco. Seychelles also recently has developed one. But I think the development of this national cybersecurity policy or strategy needs to work coherently with the strategy that we have to bring about for fintech, and we have to keep in mind that these policies or strategies will evolve with time, with changing environments, and when these evolve, they should not evolve separately but together, so that they remain relevant and coherent. Lastly, with regards to governance of data, there's been a number of debates. I think Seto is very passionate about localization of data, and I think that to close off, there was a valid point that whether a country decides for localization or not depends on a number of factors, on the pool of capacity in the country, on the availability of the infrastructure in the country, economies of scale. So it's a delicate subject that each country has to decide on its own and see what works for it. Rather than that, with regards to data, with regards to consent, with regards to transparency and control, I think a valid point which we need to keep in mind is that there is a need for greater capacity building, both on a technical end, but also for the financial consumer, so that in the end, because in the end, this is, I mean, I think for regulators in this room, I think this is what we care about, is that we protect them. And if we build capacity, if we educate them, they are able to make more informed decision about their data and how this is dealt with. Yeah, I think I've covered it all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chung Sam, for the concise summary of today's deliberations. This concludes another day of intense, fruitful, and eye-opening debates and discussions which will surely contribute towards the development of fintech in Seychelles. I would like to invite everyone to have some coffee and refreshments in the lobby before we call it a day. We shall reconvene tomorrow, refreshed and ready to further our discussions on another important theme, which is fintech business models. To note, tomorrow at the end of the workshop, you are all cordially invited to a lunch with a touch of Seychelles culture. I would also like to inform the presenters that the presentation slides will be shared on the workshop website. In this regard, I would appreciate if you could kindly liaise with members of the Secretariat. On this note, I thank you for being attentive and for your participations. I wish you all a pleasant evening.